I am glad to be back here today. It's been about 3 years since we last had the opportunity to come and visit New Life, and during that time, a lot's happened. I believe they have a short PowerPoint to show. It's about 7 minutes, and it will tell a little bit about some of our journey, and some of that will play into what I speak about in a few minutes. But I just want to express appreciation specifically to the church here. I've seen in the music that we sang today, some of the posters advertising, like the Texas Youth Conference that's coming up, that there is a focus on giving God control in our life and letting God have his way in us. And I really appreciate that. And also, specifically, through this last week, as I've been preparing for this, I felt a lot of awareness of what seems like spiritual resistance and warfare. And so I'd like to just briefly pray that God would have his way in the service and what I say and what you see and the technology. We know that the enemy has many ways that he likes to resist us. So just briefly, and then if they would start the PowerPoint after that. Lord, we pray for your authority in this place. We pray for your resistance against the enemy, that you would surround us, that the church would be unified in this prayer, that your angels would fight for us against any resistance, any plans the enemy may have prepared for this day. Pray that you'd open hearts and ears to hear what you want said as well. In your name I pray. Amen.
There are about 7,000 languages in the world. Of these, 1,700 have no known scriptures and no known translation taking place. That's 25% of all known languages. Millions of people don't know God can speak their heart language. They are still waiting to hear about Jesus. The reality of Christian service is that we are in a battle. Where the fighting is fierce, many soldiers get wounded. Missionary stress is often high, with frequent transitions, language stress, culture stress, seemingly unquenchable needs all around. Immense pressure from a variety of sources, high expectations, difficult working conditions, and separation from support bases such as home churches, family, and friends. Pressure on individuals, marriages, and families can be crushing. In January of 2010, even after teaching on missionary stress and burnout in orientation courses, Paul and I realized that we too are jars of clay and had reached our breaking point. In the spring of 2010, we moved to North Carolina, near the Jar Center, and began our healing journey. Amidst the prayers of many fervent prayer partners, we began reaching out for help. We found some sources to be more reliable than others, and the journey has not always been easy, but God has been faithful. Through His grace and goodness, He is restoring new life and wholeness to our hearts, souls, minds, and bodies.
You feel like dancing, he said the carpet needs to be replaced. When I listen to the music, it's hard to sit still. 5 years ago, Christy and I were in the middle of a crisis. We'd been home from Cameroon for about a year and a half. We'd been serving there with Wycliffe Associates, and I'd been serving as a construction manager. In addition to that, I had been traveling around West Africa and consulting with other SIL departments on construction needs. I'd been connecting with various SIL branches, looking at their needs and trying to connect to the volunteer pool that Wycliffe Associates had available. I was serving as an elder at our missions community church, and I was trying to be a dad and a husband with too little knowledge and too little time and too little Jesus and too much stress. God had brought us to the realization that we needed to come home and deal with our burnout and trauma from 7 years of marriage that was getting worse and worse in terms of how I treated my wife and my kids. He had placed us at JARS. We'd started receiving some help. Some was helpful and some was less helpful. But that was helpful had begun to help us heal emotionally and physically and spiritually. But now we were facing a new crisis. We were on our way here to Dallas to speak at New Life and a few other churches. And while we were traveling, we received emails from 3 of our partners that said they would no longer be able to support us. One of them specifically said it seemed we had no vision for our ministry. In a way, that was true. We did have a vision, but I was afraid to share it. And the reason I was afraid to share it is I didn't know how to tell people I didn't want to manage construction projects anymore, and that I felt like God was leading me to work more closely with Christy in providing soul care, or as we called it back then, member care, for missionaries who were in transition or dealing with stress or trauma on the field. It felt like it was too much of a shift, and that we were trying to do something that was very far outside of what my experiences were. And truth be told, we didn't know how our partners would respond. But receiving these emails catalyzed us, and we realized we have to do something. So when we came here to New Life in 2011, and I know that some of you remember this, we had a chance to share about our desire to care for missionaries. And to our amazement and our excitement, the church embraced that and encouraged us in that. And it gave us the strength and the courage to go on and share that with other churches who also embraced that and encouraged us in it. We mentioned it in a prayer letter, and the director of Cameroon branch, the personnel director of Cameroon branch, encouraged us to come and serve with them there in the branch. We requested an assignment change within Wycliffe Associates, and after a month of waiting, we received an answer that said, there is no such need, and the answer is no. Well, we found out afterwards that there was a need, but as is typical on the missions community and in the service departments, there wasn't any personnel to get the job posted. Everyone was too busy. But the job was eventually posted. We requested the assignment change again with Wycliffe Associates, and again we're told, this isn't what you're trained for. It's not what our ministry focus is. If you feel led to do this, you need to go with another organization. We looked into applying with Wycliffe Bible translators, and then we did so, and it was very clear that God was involved with this, because within 2 weeks our application was accepted, and within 6 weeks we were in orientation course. Anybody who's gone through the Wycliffe application knows that that's pretty much unheard of. We were very much on the fast track back to Cameroon, we thought. God took us through orientation, we went to training courses, and suddenly we seemed to hit a brick wall. All the doors to serving overseas were closed on us. We were also told we would never do member care. And we were told that I could work in the construction maintenance department at JARS, and that was the only job in Wycliffe that was available to me. And to stay at JARS, we had to raise more money. We were really bewildered. It seemed so clear that God was leading us this way, and the about face on that crushed us. Fortunately, we had 3 major lessons we were learning at the time, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. We see that our ability to successfully care for missionaries and other people who have needs comes from 3, what I would call chords, that work together. Without any one of these 3, we feel that our ministry would be ineffective, or at best only scratch the surface of the real heart needs that people have. I didn't have this in myself. I had to learn these lessons through the experience. Let God show me how to weave them together. The good thing is these 3 lessons are available to anyone who wants to learn them, and we can all carefully and sensitively care for others as we apply them. The first principle is so easy that I missed it for almost 40 years of my life, and that is listen to Jesus. In my best moments of spirituality, I had great devotionals and I had a lot of good prayer time, But I realize now that I did all the thinking and all of the talking. There wasn't any room for Jesus to talk in the conversation. But when my ministry, all the work that I was doing for Jesus, crashed around us, when I left a 6-year project 3 months before it was completed, when my wife and my kids were terrified to hear my truck come down the street because they didn't know what kind of mood I'd be in when I came home, when I had to tell my boss and all of our prayer partners that after 5 months back on the field, we had to plan to come home again and heal, I didn't have anything left to say. I needed to hear God, and I needed to hear his voice speaking into my personal situation. I didn't need to hear my voice complaining to him. I didn't need to hear any generic anecdotes and platitudes that didn't deal with the pain that I was feeling. And I've discovered, with a lot of help, and honestly with a great example from my wife, Christy, that Jesus really passionately desires to speak to us in every area of our life. When I was busy serving him, I didn't have time to listen to him. When I began the journey towards listening to him before doing anything, I discovered that our world ran much more smoothly. There's many verses in the Bible that show the personal communication that God has had with people, just like us, and we know that their story happens to be recorded in the Bible. I've written a few of them down along with some other verses that clarify the points today, and they're on a probably purple piece of paper in your bulletin that you can look at later if you choose. We all know that David talked to God and that God responded directly to him. But God did the same with many others in the Bible. I think of Cain, Adam, Noah, Abram, Isaac, Jacob, Jeremiah, Moses, Saul turned to Paul, Amos, Jonah, Enoch, Elijah, and many others. God hasn't changed. He desires the same with us. God does speak to us in different ways, though. He speaks to us corporately as a body through his word and through pastors, evangelists, through prophets. And he speaks to us individually also through his word. He speaks through inspired and uninspired writings. He can speak through nature. He can speak through art. He can speak through other believers speaking into us. Or even, and especially, I would say, as we sit in silence and let him whisper in our hearts. Do you believe that God has every hair on your head numbered, as he said? It's something we all read in the Bible and believe. The question I ask is, why wouldn't he be equally desirous to be intimately involved in all of our daily activities, including the planning? If he cares so much about hair, why not our activities? The second chord I'd like to advocate is that of being available. First is listen to Jesus. The second, being available. Whether it's for listening to God or listening to others or allowing ourselves to rest, to be in a place to respond to his promptings on short notice, we need to be available. When we fill our waking and sleeping hours with a constant audio and visual bombardment from internet, email, telephone calls, texts, music, television, etc., we're spending emotional and mental energy that's no longer available for meeting the spontaneous needs in others. These in and of themselves aren't necessarily bad, but they do come with a price, our limited time. When we fill our minds with constant distractions, we're effectively shutting out the presence of God and deadening our ability to discern what he's saying to us. We live in an age of sound bites and short commercials and on-demand TV and on-demand movies and instant alerts from everything from news to Pinterest. I ask you to consider how much of it really matters. How much does it affect my day-to-day life? What impact may it be having on my eternity? How much would my life change if I began cutting off the constant flood of informational fluff that keeps me from deep thought and intimacy with others? What would I do if I had redeemed mental space of 3 or 4 or 5 hours a day? What might I enjoy doing as ministry if I had more time? Or who do I wish I had more time with? All of these questions I know are hard questions. If we're honest, I think most of us don't want to turn off the noise because we're scared of facing who we really are. When we make time to sit down and look intently into the mirror and let God speak to us, we find that we need to mature. We are deeply loved, and God desires for us to be his confidants, but we have to let go of habits and unforgiveness. We have to admit that we still want to run our own lives, and that we are in many areas still unsubmitted to God. And when we're faced with these, we can either draw near to God and give him control in our life, or we can harden our hearts against him and pursue our own course. Being available might mean losing your ministry. As we walked through leaving Cameroon, Christy especially, and I in different ways, grieved the loss of serving in Cameroon. She lost her home, her friends, her ministry, her place of choice to be. We left almost everything we owned behind. We lost financial partners because we were no longer serving overseas. During this time, there's a phrase that began to formulate in my mind, and as that grew, it really began to take more and more of my thought. I've never heard this phrase before, although I've discovered since that I didn't coin the phrase, but it is the winter of the soul. In the spring and summer and fall, we all know that trees give of themselves gladly and naturally. They provide leaves to feed insects, and shade plants, and shed water away from bird and animal nests, and cover themselves in glory. Flowers bloom on some trees, and the pollinators flock to them to feed, and the trees begin to replicate themselves. Fruit grows and ripens and eventually falls to the ground. Many are fed and sheltered by a tree, and then the winter comes. The leaves are usually gone by now, and the tree's exposed. Dark bark, spindly branches do little to bring shade or shelter from wind or sun. Trees look insubstantial and empty without their leaves. The sap drains down to the roots, and the tree stands as one that is dead. It's non-life-giving and doesn't have any beauty. And the winter begins. Now, it's common knowledge that many trees become bare during the winter, but not everyone knows why that happens. It's due to a process called dormancy, which is similar to hibernation. During dormancy, everything in the plant slows down. Metabolism slows down, it uses less energy, it doesn't produce new growth. It begins with changes that cause the leaves to die and fall. Now, it's possible to force a tree to avoid dormancy. If you give it a stable light and temperature environment, you can force it into what they call eternal summer. But after about 2 years, the tree will automatically put itself into dormancy, and that usually kills the tree. It is natural for trees to go through a dormancy cycle. Similarly, our souls need times of winter. Our ministry is cut off. Our energy becomes inward focused, and we slow down. Our roots are deepened and strengthened, and we find we need to be nurtured rather than nurture others. We may feel far away from God or lost or empty during this time. It's especially true if our identity comes from what we do. We may feel as though we have died, or if it would be better if we did. But if we see this as a normal part of the times and seasons that God has set for us, we can rejoice in knowing that he is sustaining us and he is giving us rest. It's a chance to know him and ourselves better and more truthfully. This leads to the third chord that we have been convinced is necessary for ministry, being vulnerable. If we're not quiet, if we don't listen to God, we can't discover the deep parts of our souls. When we begin to see into the depths of our souls, we realize that we are severely broken people in need of a Savior. When we come face to face with ourselves, we can use our brokenness to create real community, or we can hide it away under another layer of insincerity and try to maintain the illusion that all is well. Vulnerability is hard. It's scary. When you're vulnerable, you're allowing someone else to have access to your heart. You put the defenses down and essentially say, "Do unto me as was done unto my master." You turn the other cheek. When God began his deep work in my heart, the very first thing I was convicted of was my impermeability. God clearly told me, you must be vulnerable even to your own hurt. At that place in my life, vulnerability seemed like it would be easy. In fact, anything seemed like it would be easy compared to where I had found myself. But I found that vulnerability is dangerous. It's dangerous to me because someone may use it to hurt me deeply. I know that because I've walked that road. We've lost ministry, credibility, opportunity, friendships. We have felt thwarted in our desires to serve. We've been misunderstood and judged falsely. It's also dangerous to others because it threatens their walls and their defenses. When I'm vulnerable and another person is not, a balance of power is upset. This is why the religious leaders had no accusations to make against Jesus or his followers and yet could not control their hatred. They were threatened by the vulnerability of each of these, their refusal to defend themselves and demand their rights. Let me clarify, though, that vulnerability is not about saying whatever you think. Vulnerability is not about the other person. It's not about speaking the truth in love to try and get someone to change. Vulnerability is about revealing who I am with no masks on. It's about humility. It's humbling and it's subservient. And it's a paradox, a key that God uses to get past deep wounds and walls to heal broken hearts. When I am vulnerable and humbly speak about my own struggles, my own weakness, my own failing, when I honestly and truthfully declare that I'm not enough, that I'm dependent on Jesus because I found I can't do anything without him, then it shows that the strength that I have that allows me to bear myself is not mine, but his. Anybody can bluff and masquerade, but when a facade is confronted with vulnerability, it doesn't know what to do. It doesn't have anything to compare itself to. It doesn't have any competition to best. It falters and stumbles. Being vulnerable is like being silent in front of your accusers. I'm learning that no matter the consequences that come from being vulnerable, in the end, it's better than living with the knowledge that I am not being truthful about who I am. The amazing thing is, though, that humble vulnerability enables other people to be vulnerable. When I'm real about who I am, that refreshing reality of being real creates a desire and a question in other people. What if I was vulnerable? Is it safe for me to be vulnerable too? I want to be safe. We all want to be safe. Because we're tired of playing the game, but we're afraid we won't be accepted. Many people will try it, just a little bit, because it might hurt. They don't want to give too much. But if they find that someone is safe to talk to, they begin to open up more. They may reflect on themselves and share themselves emotionally, their joys and their hopes and fears and disappointments and successes and failures. As long as the listener is safe and non-judgmental, and especially if the listener continues to be vulnerable themselves, sincerity continues to grow. This in itself grows into community. Many people in the church today are afraid of close relationships, even in their own families. We play the game of having it all together on Sunday or at small group, or if we happen to run into someone from church when we go to the store. We're afraid that if we're weak, if we don't have it dressed up just right, we might be shamed or ostracized or judged. We might lose our position in the church or ministry. We might be found out to be human. And so we hide ourselves thinking, God and I can work this out. I don't need to bother someone else with this little problem. We may think the pastor's too busy, or no one else struggles with this issue, or no one else can understand my loss and my pain. And we drift a little further away from the very body that God has designed to nurture us back to health. When I hurt myself, say, smash a finger with a hammer, every part of my body, to one degree or another, is aware and on call. My mouth immediately opens to suck on the finger, or my other hand may instantly drop the hammer and apply counter pressure to the wound. My legs may carry me down the ladder or to the first aid kit without me really thinking about it. Adrenaline kicks in to give me heightened ability to function in the crisis, and my body's already pumping natural painkillers to slow down the hurt. If the skin is torn, blood coagulants and antibodies rush to the site to begin healing and defense work. A healthy body supports and cares for itself. When I sin, am traumatized by life, lose a job or a loved one suddenly, how does my church body respond? More to the point, how do I respond when I see this in another person? Do I turn away because I don't know what to say? Do I tell myself someone else is a closer friend or a small group member or a paid staff member? They're better at dealing with that problem than I would be. When I see someone struggling in a situation that I myself have faced in the past, do I think to myself, well, I got through it, and if they toughen up, they will too? Or do I consider 2 Corinthians 1:4 that says, God has comforted us in our troubles, so we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God? But that begs another question. Have I taken that struggle I am in or was in to God to listen to him and what he wants to teach me about it? Have I taken time out of my busyness to listen for him and meditate on what he wants me to learn? Because if I haven't, I probably don't have any eternal lesson that I have learned successfully that I can use to comfort others. I may have internalized a coping mechanism or a lie about who I am or where my worth comes from, but probably not God's perspective. In fact, I would contend that unless God himself reveals the meaning of the lesson, which requires us to listen, we will not gain anything of eternal value from it. Even Jesus' disciples couldn't get the lessons until Jesus explained them clearly. We can respond to him only because he first reaches out to us, and then his Spirit will teach us all things. We need to depend on him, listen to him, so we can order our schedules and lives and be available to care for others. We need to allow him to speak into us and reveal our heart's depths and brokenness so we can see ourselves as he does and learn to use our brokenness to reach out to other broken people. Too many times we see the church and others in the church as factions separate from ourselves. Whether it's doctrinal issues or preferential issues or cultural issues or anything else, we tend to separate ourselves from them. They may believe that wearing casual clothes to church is wrong. They may believe that honoring the saints in their service is right. Another group may believe that speaking in tongues and the gifts of the Spirit is only for the Church of Acts. The list of potential problems and conflicts. But if the facets aren't cut correctly in relationship to each other, it will still look pretty dull. Instead, in a well-cut stone, the facets work together to bring out the beauty of the light passing through the stone. Each facet is different, set at a different angle, interacts differently with the light, but together they bring a beauty that cannot be seen otherwise. Similarly, each of us will have a different view of God. The way God made us, the stories he's written for us, the stories he's walked us through, bring us each to see him a little differently. And this is why you'll never find a church that completely agrees with you on every theological point. This is why we have a hard time agreeing on non-essential theological issues. Like the blind men and the elephant, each of us sees God differently, and none of us have the whole picture. We need each other to learn more about God, to know each other, and to understand each other's points of view. We need to be available and vulnerable to be able to share this. This is why we need to care for each other and how we need to approach each other. Paul says in Ephesians 3, "You've heard of the administration of God's grace that he gave me for you. This grace was given to me so God's multifaceted wisdom may now be made known through the church to the rulers and authorities in the heavens." Paul goes on to pray for spiritual unity and power for the church so we may be filled with the fullness of God. We need each other so we can reveal God's wisdom and might to the powers that currently rule the world. God said in Genesis 11:6, referring to the people in Babel, if they have begun to do this as one people, all having the same language, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Similarly, in Acts 2, the disciples were all together in one place in unity when the words of God became audible for all people in Jerusalem in their own languages. The maxim that unity cannot be stopped is still true today. Jesus said in Matthew 18:19, I assure you again, if two of you agree about any matter that you pray for, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. Satan knows this. He plans to use it to gather all peoples to war against God in Revelation 20. He also shows his knowledge of this truth by working hard to destroy unity in the church. He knows he has no power against a united church. Paul says again in 1 Corinthians 1:10, I urge you, brothers, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree in what you say, that there be no divisions among you, that you be united with the same understanding and the same conviction. In closing, I urge you, listen to Jesus. Let him guide your every decision and activity through the day. Be available to one another. Serve each other. Be vulnerable. Don't lie to each other about who you are or how you're doing. Let God unite us. Not just us, not just this church, but be a piece of letting him unite his church with his strength like a three-stranded cord and shine his light through us like a multifaceted diamond so the whole world can see his beauty.